Welcome back. In this segment, we're going to be talking about sexual harassment, or as some people call it, sexual harassment. I call it harassment, so that's what you're going to be hearing. So what is sexual harassment? Well, there are different kinds. This first one is called quid pro quo. It literally means in Latin, this for that. And so in quid pro quo sexual harassment, this is sexual favors, and that is some kind of benefit. So usually the person in power will offer the person, the underling, some kind of benefit, like a raise or a promotion or some kind of status in return for sexual behavior, some kind of sexual contact. And it's usually not that clear. If you have sex with me, I will promote you. It's not usually that clear. It's usually more something like, if we engage in these kinds of, if we do this, if we have sex, there is that big promotion coming up, that's going to be available. And it's just sort of hung there, like somehow they might be tied together, but you didn't say they were tied together, but they might be. So it's usually not super clear, but it's easy to infer what the person means. The hostile work environment type of sexual harassment is usually where it's usually been, where in a mostly male environment, they've made it very clear that females are not welcome. But there have been cases recently where it's been flipped, where it's been a mostly female workplace and the male was made to feel like they didn't really belong there. And the intent in the hostile work environment is to make the minority sex feel like they're not really part of the group, or that their sexuality matters, that they're, the fact that they have the other genitals really matters in the workplace. Sometimes the hostile work environment takes the form of, telling jokes where the minority sex is always the punchline, or telling jokes that are kind of sexual in nature to make the minority sex person feel uncomfortable. It could be even more explicit bullying that might happen in a hostile work environment where, for example, there was a case in a fire department where the female firefighter was the first one ever in the station, and the male firefighters made it very difficult for the female. They they made it, none of the seats were available for her to sit down for dinner. They escalated to putting dildos in her bed. So, they all have bunks at the fire station, right? And they put dildos in hers, or they wrote lesbian on her locker, even though she was not a lesbian, but it was just a way to sort of, make her feel like an other. And the intention was to make it uncomfortable for her. And of course, the male firefighters said, "Oh, we were just joking." And that's what oftentimes happens in hostile work environments. We're just joking. But it can make the person who's in the minority group feel very isolated and based on their sex, right? You're doing this because I'm female and you all are male, or because I'm male and you all are female. So hostile work environment. Now it's expanded out a little bit more too. It can now be, you can find cases where it's just that the person's sexuality, their genitals, are really being highlighted as a way to pick on them or bully them. There was a case on a deep sea oil rig where the men would go out for like a month at a time, and it was an entirely men crew, and the new guy complained to his supervisor because the guys who'd been there longer, every time they would pass him in the hall, they would flick him in the testicles. And the supervisor said, you're going to have to toughen up because, they're just trying to get under your skin and you're letting them. And so because the supervisor didn't do anything about it, then he escalated and ultimately filed a complaint because he was being sexually harassed. I mean, hitting somebody in the testicles is about as specifically sexually harassing as you can get. And they were doing it, they were making a hostile work environment, right? They were making it difficult for him to do his job and targeting his testicles. So that's a very specific, good example of how it can be men who are victimized by other men. It could be men who are victimized by women. It could be women who are victimized by men. Same thing with the quid pro quo. Initially, when sexual harassment laws first came around, the assumption was that the women were always the victims. And now there have been cases that have established that men can be victimized also. And it doesn't always have to be between the sexes. It can be same-sex harassment. All the other women in the office are suing you for sexual harassment. Since you haven't sexually harassed me, I'm suing you for discrimination. Just thought I'd throw in a little lightness. This whole chapter has been a bit of a serious chapter, so I threw in a little cartoon to make it a little lighter. But anyway, let's talk about sexual harassment laws. All right. So this is our Equal Employment Opportunity Commission from the federal government. They provide their definitions of sexual harassment and stuff. What I wanted you to notice is, first off, the employer has to have 15 or more employees to fall under the sexual harassment laws, which is really interesting because, you know, the bulk of the businesses in the U.S. are small businesses that have fewer than 15 employees. So if you're in a small, there was a case of a woman who worked for an auto repair shop, and it was an independent auto repair shop. And she complained to her supervisor because she would have to go into the back where the guys were actually working. And, you know, if UPS has delivered a part or whatever, she'd have to take it back to them. And she didn't like it that they had calendars or posters up out there that had scantily clad or naked women out in the workshop area. And so she complained to her boss. The boss didn't see a problem with it. So she complained to the EEOC, and the EEOC said, the employer has to have 15 or more employees for us to be able to do anything. So it doesn't protect everybody. The sexual harassment laws do not protect everybody. The other thing I wanted to attract your attention to is the time limits. If a person has a claim to make, they need to file the charge with the EEOC within 180 days of the event. So you can't sort of sit on it for years. We've been seeing a lot of that in the news recently, where people are now much retrospectively saying, you know, I was harassed in different work situations by different people. And it's way too late to actually legally do anything about that. Now, of course, we can, you know, do something about the person's, you know, standing in the community and things like that by bringing these things forward. But if something's going to be done, you have 180 days to file a charge with the EEOC. One of the things I feel like when I'm, you know, when I'm teaching this class, I feel like the more important thing for me to do is then to tell you guys what sexual harassment is and try and tell you how not to be a harasser, is to focus on the victim side and say, you know, if something has happened at work that falls under the quid pro quo or falls under the hostile work environment category, the first thing you need to do is start documenting what has happened. Second thing that you need to do is tell your supervisor. In fact, let's look at the Washington state law. Washington state law says, communicate to the harasser or their supervisor that the offensive behavior is unwelcome. The best thing that you can do is tell the harasser to stop it. I don't think that's funny, or no, I'm not interested. I need you to stop doing that. And it's really hard to say that to the harasser. A lot of us have been raised to be nice. A lot of us have been raised to be polite. And so it's just really like not in our wheelhouse to tell somebody who's making us feel super uncomfortable to stop making us feel uncomfortable. So you don't have to speak to the harasser under the Washington state law. You can go to the supervisor instead. The important thing is that you report it, because if you don't say something explicitly, stop that. And you think, well, I'll just use body posture or eye rolling, or I'll just avoid the person. You haven't met that first step for it to be actually sexual harassment, because the person has plausible deniability. I'm just joking. Well, I was just flirting. Right? They have that plausible deniability. So you have to say to them or to their supervisor, I need this behavior to stop. I don't like it. Then you have to report it to management or human resources. Get it documented. And it's always a good idea to write things down in a little notebook or something with dates and a description of what happened. Save any emails, any texts, anything like that. Save all that stuff, because it may be relevant later. And then there are 3 governmental agencies that they want you to report to. First off, the Washington State Attorney General's Office, the Washington State Human Rights Commission, and then the EEOC. So you need to report. And so I feel like the most important thing that I can do for people in my classes is to teach them to immediately deal with it. Like hoping it's going to go away it's not going to go away. A person who thinks it's funny to tell these jokes or thinks it's just natural flirting to say these things, they're not going to change their behavior unless somebody tells them to change their behavior. And so I'm kind of targeting victims as far as like, it's not just like, can you deal with it? It's knowing that other people after you are going to be treated like this too if you don't say something now, right? So it can be maybe empowering to think about it like that you're actually doing the world a favor. So let's talk a little bit about some of the effects of sexual harassment on the victims of sexual harassment. First off, there has been evidence that it can cause depression in the victim. And here we have a study of 1,000 victims that showed the harassment in the teens and early 20s was associated with increased depression in the 30s. And the researchers attributed it to the person experiencing, self-doubt and self-blame and wondering if somehow they contributed or did they do it? And, like, is this my fault? And all these self, reflection things that may be contributing to them, not realizing that they were the victim. It's not their fault. So it can cause depression later on. Post-traumatic stress disorder can sometimes happen. They studied women in the military, and they found that those who had been sexually harassed had higher rates of PTSD than the veterans who had been in combat. It's more traumatic to be sexually harassed at work. It has longer lasting effects than combat for military veterans. Blood pressure. A study of 1,200 union workers from Boston, 23% of them reported that they had experienced some kind of sexual harassment. And they found that those who had experienced sexual harassment had higher blood pressure than those who did not report sexual harassment. Sleep problems. It turns out that a lot of times people who are having difficulty at work like this, where they're being victimized and they feel helpless at work and things like that, may, for one thing, have sleep disturbances where they can't get to sleep or they wake up in the middle of the night. And it might be because they're ruminating over the events and wondering how they could handle it differently or things like that. Some have nightmares that interrupt their sleep, and it might be, a symptom of PTSD. Higher rates of suicide. In a study of 1,000 Canadian high school students, again, that 23% reported sexual harassment. So that seems to be about the number of people who get sexually harassed in an institution. 15% of the harassed girls reported suicide attempts compared to 2% of the non-harassed girls. So it makes a lot of times the victim internalizes what happened, and that causes all this psychological impact. And then neck pain, physical symptoms, right? Where a study of 4,000 Canadian women showed that those who reported neck pain were 1.6 times as likely to have been harassed than people who didn't report neck pain. So again, this is one of those things that can have psychological, physical effects that can last for a long time. So it's not something that we should be sort of ignoring anymore. It's something that I especially really want to drive home. If it's something that has been happening to you, immediately report to the supervisor that, I don't have the nerve to say anything to the person who's doing it to me. So can you please speak to them and let them know I do not want them to be saying this or that anymore. And I'll just leave you with a story from my early 20s. I was working at a mortgage lending division, and it was a mostly female department. We had about 100 employees and about mostly females, except for the appraiser and the VIP loan officer, the one he would get like the big loans. And so those two had adjacent cubicles, and they were across the aisle from my cubicle. And I was, 23 years old, working my way through college, and just a little clerk typist there. And they would make jokes that were of sexual nature, and they'd always want to tell me their jokes. My husband was in the Coast Guard and he was on temporary assigned duty, and they were teasing me about how he's probably cheating on me and these kinds of things. Just little, like, always about, something sexual every time they talk to me. And so first I tried to be brave and told them, your jokes aren't funny. Can you please stop telling those jokes around me? And they tried to do the old, oh, you got no sense of humor kind of thing. And then when they were teasing me about my husband being deployed, I was like, you guys, that's not funny. I mean, would you like me to say stuff like that about you and your wife, right? And they gave me the, oh, ho, ho, that's dismissing what I said. Finally, after several weeks of it, I went to my supervisor and I told her, these guys are driving me nuts. This is what and I had it all documented. I'm like this, they said this on Tuesday, and then last Friday they said this. And so she goes marching out there and she goes, knock it off. I do not want to hear any more of this. They left me alone after that. I did not have to report to anyone above my direct supervisor, but it took a lot of nerve. And part of it, I think, is because I was studying IO psychology and I had been through a bunch of sexual harassment training. And I was like, I knew it. Like, I'd already been trained these things. And one of the things that my professor really emphasized was empowering the victim. And so I hope between my story and between these pieces of evidence and my encouragement, hopefully that if you're ever in this situation, or if you are currently in this situation, that you will immediately tell your supervisor, even if you're too nervous to say something to the person that's teasing you or harassing you. And, think about how much it'll benefit everybody else in the long run if you can do that. So that's my final comment in this section on sexual coercion and finishing with sexual harassment. So I will see you guys in the next chapter.